Well, tomorrow will mark exactly a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, and the war is showing no sign of relenting. Almost 43,000 people are believed to have been killed over the past 12 months, while over 15,000 are said to be missing. Let's talk about this with Emeritus Professor Robert Schrire from the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Professor, very good evening to you. Grateful for your time. So, 1 year on, can we even make sense of the fact that this has lasted as long as it's done? Because when Russian tanks first rolled into Kyiv and surrounding areas, this was what the Russians said was a special military operation that would last just a few days.
I think what we've really witnessed is one of the most massive miscalculations of modern history. And it's interesting also to look at why. It's very clear now that Putin started off with a maximal agenda of essentially removing the Ukrainian government and creating a satellite state linked to Russia, some kind of confederation or federation in which Russia controlled the economy and the government of Ukraine. That was the goal, that was the expectation, and of course one of the questions is, why did he have these goals? And obviously, we could spend a lot of time, but I think the bottom line is two major errors. One, he did not believe that the West would act in a united and punitive sense. And remember, he got away with invading Georgia in 2008. He got away with taking over Crimea and part of the Donbass in 2014. So he expected a repeat of that performance. Secondly, he believed his own propaganda that the Ukraine was not a real country, that there was no nationalism, and that basically they would roll over and embrace the Russians. So I think he didn't really have, if you will, a secondary set of ambitions, a second set of goals. So when the first one failed, he really was left in a position where he couldn't change course.
And he has, even in speaking during the State of the Nation address in Moscow this week, defended his actions, still saying that this is a special military operation basically meant to avenge, shall we say, ethnic Russians and other people in areas such as the Donbass, who he says have been mistreated by neo-Nazis, a.k.a. the Ukrainian government, and recommitted to this conflict. Should we expect things to get a lot worse then in this coming year?
I think there's no doubt that rather tragically, Putin, first of all, didn't have a secondary objective. In other words, he didn't, in a sense, plan A is to conquer Ukraine. If that doesn't work, plan B is to do something else. So, first of all, he was caught somewhat surprised, I think totally shocked by the reaction. But secondly, given the fact that in a dictatorship, you can't really very easily change leaders, and leaders therefore cannot, in a sense, admit that they were wrong. As he sees it, his only chance is to double down on his original goal, however impractical. So he doesn't have a second prize. He doesn't seem able to find that. And so he is simply pressing on with very damaging consequences for Ukraine, damaging consequences for Russia, and damaging consequences for the rest of the world.
What does that then mean for a potential end to the invasion of Ukraine? Has it moved further out of reach? Is there still a chance that we could see a face-to-face meeting between Putin and Zelensky?
I think looking at the balance of forces, and essentially we're talking about two levels. The first level, perhaps the most important, is the military level. What happens on the battlefield? Secondly, the politics, the internal dynamics. Now, it's quite clear that for the moment, the Russian demands and the Ukrainian ability to meet those demands are in negative territory. There is no room for a negotiated settlement now. So that really leaves us with perhaps three options. First option is Ukraine wins, and this is the game that they are playing. Now, of course, to say Ukraine wins doesn't really tell us a lot, because does it mean going back to the borders of 1991? Does it mean going back to the borders after Crimea was taken? Or does it mean going back to the borders at the present situation? Mm-hmm. So that is if Ukraine wins. Secondly, if Russia wins, the question is, what would that victory look like? And when I say Russia wins, I mean that Putin believes he has now achieved his goals. Part of the problem is he hasn't specified what those goals are. Clearly, they can't be the conquest of Ukraine. Are they simply parts of the eastern Donbass, Luhansk? We don't know. Mm-hmm. If Russia wins, well, then that's the second outcome, also unlikely. So a Russian victory, a Ukrainian victory, very unlikely. Mm-hmm. Now, the third option would be a stalemate. I think we can agree that there is no prospect of successful negotiations at the moment. Putin cannot back down. Putin cannot win, so Putin has to continue along the failed path. Similarly, I don't think Ukraine can win on the battlefield, and I would think after all the loss of life and destruction, the public opinion of the Ukrainian people, the opinion of the Ukrainian military, would make it very, very difficult, in fact, probably impossible, for Zelensky to compromise on Ukraine's border. So that means a negotiated settlement is impossible at this stage. I think the most likely outcome is another year of fighting, at which stage we will essentially know the limits of military force, and perhaps a stalemate. If you look at so many of the conflicts in the world, many of them simply end in an unresolved stalemate. Mm-hmm. Think of Israel and her neighbors. Think of so many others of these kind of issues. In other words, perhaps the stalemate would see Russia dominating the East, focusing all their military force on the Donbass region, the areas which Putin claims to have annexed, and then essentially to perhaps have a low-level bombing campaign against Kyiv to simply remind them that they are not the victors in the conflict. Uh-huh. So it would be a messy stalemate with Russia withdrawing its invasion army. Putin can then say he has won the battle, he has liberated the East from the anti-Russians, from the Nazis, and Ukraine can at least say that they have saved their country and prevented it from being destroyed. But this obviously would be a very unstable situation. Okay. The West would be expecting Russia to perhaps attack at a later stage.
Emeritus Professor Robert Schrire, good to speak to you with the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town.